On this week's episode of Crowdfunding Nerds, we talk about dealing with negative feedback. We cover negative comments, how culture impacts feedback, questions to ask playtesters, focusing your attention on those who like your game, and more. Let's get into it.
Game begin.
Let's go.
Go back to the shadow. You shall not fail. Crowdfunding Nerds.
Amazing.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another awesome episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. I am your host, Andrew Lowen, and I'm joined by Sean and Donnie this morning. Donnie is a member of our team that works on ads and things like that. And Donnie has a project of his that he's been working on for a number of years. In fact, I would wager to say it's been about 10 years or more that you've been working on this thing. I mean, at
More or
least
less.
8 years since I've known you. And it's and you had a really interesting question for me, or line of questions I thought would just make a much better podcast than a regular discussion, private discussion. So I invited you onto the podcast to talk about this thing. So you want to frame our topic?
You're just gonna
Yeah. So what? How would you frame our topic?
Okay, yeah. So the idea was, okay, so we're coming up on putting the project out there, and it's something that most creators have that moment of like, okay, like it's to the point where it's now it has to come out to the public. And I was talking with my business coach about this, and we were just kind of talking about like, okay, well, my boss, like I've seen him go through this for a number of years now, and it's just like, how do we process that? She's like, you need to talk to him about it. Like, what has he done to go through negative comments, people, outright attacking not just the game, but his character, his person himself. And so that's kind of what the idea of this podcast was. It's like, okay, actually going through how to process, actual negative criticism, or, comparing what is real criticism versus what you perceive as negative criticism. Even things like cancel culture, and like, okay, like, cause that can be a very scary thing for people. It's like, what if I just slip up and all of a sudden, like I'm destitute, So yeah, just wanted to get your insights on that as someone who's been there. And for someone, like me and people listening that are about to cross that chasm.
Yeah.
I don't think you can help you, Andrew. I don't think Deliverance has ever been criticized, and
Oh yeah, not at all.
yeah,
No.
never. It's just like everyone loves them.
That's why I picked such a safe topic, so that I would just be safe. Yeah, so it's interesting because I recall a podcast Sean and I did a long time ago on the subject was Felicia Day's book, where the in essence it boiled down to criticism of, well, Felicia Day is the star of a show called The Guild, which is a very cult classic show amongst World of Warcraft players and others. But the Guild, whenever somebody criticized the Guild, she would take it personally, and she kind of went through her process of disassociating her value with the value of the show. And so eventually her conclusion was, your value is not wrapped up in what you make. And that was a good discussion. So that might actually be worthwhile. Kind of tackles things from a different angle, but just general negativity. I mean, there are a lot of ways that you could experience negativity. That I have experienced negativity. I've experienced the full gamut of negative emotions, and for all intents and purposes, I'm a rather small project out there. I think that Deliverance is something that has a significant future, and it's been growing and everything. I think that people hopeful for a great first project, or like the special project they've been working on, that it would be an amazing result for them. And it just, for me, I think the first thing is, the more you care about something, the more it hurts you when it doesn't do well, just in general. And you want things to go well. And as a Christian, I look at the challenges of life, and I kind of liken them to weeds in a garden. Like, I want I remember I was growing tomato plants, and this one time I don't have a green thumb, not a very good. But tomato plants, supposedly tomato plants and blueberry plants, you can't get them wrong, And other than the number one pest that I had to deal with were children that would pick the green ones. It's like, stop that, But so I remember, I would regularly have to pull weeds that just never seemed to be there before I planted things that I wanted to harvest. And I think that the same can be said for projects that you're working on. Passion projects have weeds, which naturally crop up and need to be removed or impede progress. And I think that it's a natural part of dealing with adversity is a natural part of and also pressure for that matter. It's a natural part of making something, especially making something great. So where specifically do you want to get started?
Well, I mean, a good place to start, I think, is we have, as creators, when we're crossing that chasm, we have okay, what do I do when somebody does? Because I see people all around me, on social media or whatever, dealing with these things, and they deal with it either in a really healthy way, or they deal with it in a really awful way and end up going on a rant or something, and because it just builds up and they get frustrated, and now it's okay, well, you just alienated half your audience, if not all of it, and now you're totally blacklisted, and nobody wants that. The goal is to, when you make something, it's okay, I want to maybe make this a career in doing this thing. So we could tackle actual versus perceived negativity might be a good way to start.
Okay, sure. So the and in my experience, I've experienced much actual negativity, and also it's very easy. But I would say more than anything, more than actual negativity, I think perceived negativity is a much more common situation. But actually, I think that there's one thing even before that, which is when nobody cares about your product, nobody knows about it. That can be frustrating also. But as far as when you start to get momentum going and people know or connect with your product in some way, think about how you connect with other products. Are you play video games?
Yeah, not as much, but yeah, I do.
What is a game that you love?
Sea of Thieves.
What's a game that sucks?
Anything that's not Sea of Thieves. No. I have a hard time getting into Minecraft, which obviously doesn't mean it's a bad game. It's one of the most popular games. For me, I don't enjoy it as much,
Yeah. So it's really easy for us to say, what's a great game and what's a game that I hate. For example, I don't like
Right.
Ticket to Ride. I don't like Brass Birmingham. I think those games suck. Brass Birmingham happens to be ranked number 1 on Board Game Geek, and Ticket to Ride. One thing I do love is I love how much money Ticket to Ride has made. And so there's an obvious I think they suck. And it's so easy for me to say, but if I were talking to Alan Moon, the designer of Ticket to Ride, or the designer of Brass Birmingham, or even a hardcore fan of either of those games, they would be offended or potentially or hurt by that. But that's what I'm saying is not actual criticism or anything like that. It's I'm not meaning to be negative. I'm just expressing an opinion, and people have the right to an opinion. And so it's so much easier to share about some intangible third-party thing that you have no connection to rather than something that's closer. So the first thing I think that's really important to understand is that customers have the way that they think about products, and they may not share that truth with you. They may express positivity and give you an email address when they're like, hey, I played your game or whatever, or I read the script and I think that it's awesome. And they give you their email because you ask them. And the email that they give you is for the spam emails, because they actually have no intent of backing your product. They were not impressed. They actually thought it was lame. There was nothing special about it, but they didn't want to tell you that because they're, they don't want to be
Two-faced
cruel
liars.
to you. Right. Well, it's funny because, you run into this problem where people don't want to express their true feelings when it will negatively affect you. And so then you run into this other group of people that will express negative feelings, meaning they will say, I thought that the crescendo of the plot was kind of a letdown. This particular character's story. By the way, your project Seraphima, you've written what will become a book, right?
Right. In theory, we're playing around with what to do with it, but yeah, essentially right now it's a book. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like 50 chapters of awesomeness. So
yeah, it's 52 chapters. You can read one chapter a week and be good.
yeah. So so anyway, to give context, so that's why I say things like crescendo and plot and whatever. But if I were to actually read through and not be very impressed, let's say, do you think that I would tell you that I was unimpressed with your work?
I think you would, because we know each other. But I think if it was one of those things of, if you were just reading the book, and you just found it and you just decided, like, you know what, this is not great, you probably wouldn't say a word about it. You'd probably just set it aside and move on.
Yeah. I think maybe there are some indicators that somebody might not be super impressed with work without actually, having them speak it. That one, in fact, my favorite with Deliverance was the body language of the players. So if they were into it, you could tell. And if they were not, they would be sitting back, folding their arms, checking their cell phone, um, not understanding, or they might not have an idea of what to do during their turn because they weren't thinking about it, and things like that. And so that was actually, for me, among the most helpful feedback that I ever received was the body language of players. Like, are they into it or not? What pulled them out of the immersion or whatever. But I would actually say, what I'm getting at is you want to seek those out that are willing to give you feedback that's not positive, because I would say negative feedback is probably the wrong word for it. I would call it constructive criticism, right? In fact, one of the most helpful bits of this type of feedback that I ever received was, and I think I might have talked about it on this podcast once, but back in the day when Deliverance was just pen and paper prototype, I made a version of the game and brought it to a local convention around 2017, and actually brought Richard with me. Rick is the SEO wizard at our company, and he and I participated in this event called Unpub. um, Unpub was a sideshow of this big convention that people could come in and play unpublished games. You had some companies there that were well known and others that were just indie designers like me. And so I remember we had probably played like 6 or 7 games of Deliverance over the 2 days that we were there. And there was this one guy that chose a character called Shula, which is in the actual game. She's kind of like a fire mage. She has like super high damage and whatnot. And her character was not all that different from what she was at that time. Like the character today that people actually play. The base kit was not all that different. And the one difference was we started with no resources. So you had to build up resources in order to do your cool abilities. And this guy, his very first turn, he sat down, he played, and he was like, okay, I want to use this attack. I'm like, all right, the attack deals 2 damage. And he was like, okay. And he looked at me and looked at the character and he said, that sucks. It's like, okay. So he's not very into it. And and he told me he wasn't really a fan of games like this. Like, it'll be fine, you'll like my game, it'll be great. And I could tell he was not super enthusiastic about playing it, but his friends really wanted to play it. And he just let me know anytime he felt unimpressed about something, he let me know. And I was like just trying to help him have a good time, like it was one of those situations like, what do? You've got a guy who doesn't want to sit there, but his friends are sitting there and having fun. And he's just like folding his arms, trying to grin and bear through it. And at the end of the experience, I got their feedback. I got like 3 emails from the 4 people. The one guy obviously did not give me his email. He was just like, I wasn't interested in this, and it just felt like my character was weak and whatever. So I reflected back on that and thought, so the customer, it's not really their job to tell you how to fix your product because they don't really know a whole lot, but they understand like the product that you're trying to put together, they understand how it made them feel, and they can express that there's a problem, right? And that was a clear indicator that there was a problem in his mind. And it would be so easy for me to have just like brush it off and be like, well, he didn't like games like this anyway, and he doesn't understand, and he doesn't understand my genius, and that is so common. I am so annoyed with people that are just narcissistic about their product, where they're like, this product is the best product ever, and there's no possible way that it could improve. And it's so frustrating. But the what I find is was the most useful bit of feedback at that convention was the guy saying it sucks. And the reason for that was because I was able to identify the faintest like string of a problem that I could start pulling on to get to the root of the issue. And the root of the issue was that the game started out a little too slow. And by it's almost like, I'll use other game analogies, but like Monopoly. Imagine if you started Monopoly with no money. You just had no money at all in Monopoly, right? Or like Terraforming Mars, the game is really great, but it gets way better with the Prelude expansion, which just gives you some starting resources, and it cuts the game length by like 3 turns because you have just a little bit of starting resources that you can use to build momentum and combos and everything earlier, and it just makes things, you get to the fun faster, right?
Right.
And so I made that one adjustment of adding to courage. So you have this resource, you build like an energy bar and spend it on cool abilities, and you started out with 0 at this convention. And then the next after I kind of distilled down the feedback and made changes, I added 2 courage, and all of a sudden players had a several different choices of valid skills that they are valid, moves they could make, and they were very engaged. And when on turn 2 somebody uses all their resources and they're like, wow, I'm like stuck, they're like, I put myself in this position, I need to recover, and it became something that was much different. So it was funny because others that were with him at the table, when he said this sucks, they were very disparaging of his commentary because naturally you would, it was a mean thing to say, but it wasn't a mean spirited thing to say. It actually helped me make the game better.
Right. Because he
So
wasn't just saying, Andrew, you suck. He was saying,
Right.
okay, this experience sucks, which makes
Right.
sense, but we can take
Yeah.
it to mean like, oh, there must be something wrong with me,
Absolutely. Or they don't understand. They don't understand, and
Right.
it's really like you gave them all the tools to understand and they didn't get it. So what did you give them that was missing? What did you present that was unclear? And or what wasn't tightened? I mean, I want to say I'd been working on the game for about a year and a half at that time, and that was kind of the first public unveiling, if you will. And it had a very long way to go, but I mean, we didn't get to Kickstarter until summer of 2021. So, and I've seen along the road of playtesting. I was part of various playtesting groups. I eventually started running the San Diego board game designers group, and had a couple of 100 people in it. And just to selfishly, I needed more opportunities to test my game, and so I thought I would facilitate everyone testing their games, and that would allow me to test mine. So it's kind of a rising tide raises all ships sort of
For
moment.
sure.
But yeah, it was very difficult to criticize. So the reason I brought that up is because you have, as a game designer, playtesting your game with other game designers, I had to I wanted to give negative feedback, rather constructive criticism to others, and it's very, very difficult for others to receive constructive criticism about their products that they've made. A lot of the time, in fact, I would say the number one thing that happens when others receive it. So, and I've given lots of constructive criticism. It's they try to explain why. They try to explain why this is the way it is, why you're wrong, or why it's this way because of that thing, and but it doesn't matter to me. I'm here sitting there, and I don't care why. But the thing, even beyond, I just care about a good experience. I want the best experience possible, and I see a way to improve it, or I see a problem that impeded my excellent experience, and yeah, maybe there's a reason and whatever. But when I buy your game and I play it in my house and I have that same experience, you will not be around to explain why the thing is the way it is. And so the end result of not listening to that feedback is failure. It's that's a much worse conclusion than getting offended or you know so I think there's a lot to be said there. I don't know if you want to unpack anything more about that.
So what I gather from that is that you have to kind of prep yourself when you go into those situations, where you have to kind of come in as like, okay, there's going to be people who don't like it. There's going to be people who just flat out, blast you or whatever. And it's like, okay, but like you said with Felicia Day, it's like you have to detach your ego from what you're making. It's like that's not whether it's good or succeeds or fails is not a reflection on you as a person, right? I actually think back when you were telling me the story, it's like when we first actually met in person at NorwestCon, and I sat down just to show you where Seraphima was a game at the time before I started writing, and the guy just came over and just started blasting it. Like, it wasn't playing it, just came over and was touting his street cred. And it's like, okay, that's fine. And it said oh, you have fighting animals. Who's going to want to play this? Like, okay, well, that's fine. It's like, that's your opinion on that. Right.
That's the response to that.
Yeah. Right. But it's like, okay, but it's funny because I still think back to that. It was like, okay, but he did have street cred. Like he did have designing cred, whatever, how big or small, it doesn't matter. It's like, okay. And in his mind, I had to put myself in his shoes. Like he's trying to help.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't trying to just come over and just be a jerk. He's like, no, I see someone with a game. I want to learn about it. How can I help?
Yep.
One thing I'll add as well, is especially if you're at a convention which attracts international people from all over the world, like an international audience, you have to also be aware of different cultures and how they deal with conflict. So, and I grew up in South Africa, and South Africans have a very it's probably because of the Dutch influence. And I think it's the same with the Dutch, is that they can be very direct, which can be very helpful, but a lot of people can interpret that as rude. And sometimes they're not being rude, they're just being direct. It's part of their culture. Exact same thing for Asian culture. My sister-in-law, her family are from Malaysia, and their whole family is super direct. They just tell you things straight to your face, and it can be quite off-putting and rude. But in terms of UK and Irish culture, that's not the case. It's very much, innuendo, read between the lines, almost a bit two-faced. So that might be the case where you're just at a convention, and someone from a different culture comes up and they just speak their mind. You might interpret that as being rude because it's sort of not how you tend to do things. But for them, this is the everyday life. This is how they act. This is what they do. So maybe just being sensitive to that as well, that different cultures will have different ways of giving you feedback, and some of it can be. So in this case, I don't know if this person was from a different country, but that might be something that they just do. You come up and you don't like something, you just speak your mind, and you move on with your life. Otherwise, you have to use tact, and there's a bit more here and there, and just kind of suggesting gently. So I'm sure also personality comes into it as well. But that's something to just keep in mind, is that people from different cultures might have different ways of expressing their thoughts.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. I think that's why English and Irish writing have the best poetry. Like, it's like, it's very, yeah. Anyway, go ahead. This is the first thing I thought of when you talk about the difference in how we perceive things. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Sean.
Yeah. I'll also say, there are some cases that I've been told much the same. It's like, why would you go with a theme like this? Like a religious theme it sounds lame because of religion. You're just going to ruin a mechanically good game with this kind of a garbage theme, and I received that feedback a number of times. And when I say a number, the number is more than like 24 times a year, and all the time. It's like there was really no Christian themed game that did well at all in the hobby space while I was working on this. And so many people were like, why would you ever go with this? And I had this vision in my head, and I'm like, they don't understand, but what will make them understand is when they see the art and they see the gameplay and how it works together. They'll understand that it could never be anything else other than what it is. And that's, I think, one of the most critical components. If Deliverance was thematically kind of pasted on, it could be pirates and ninjas and zombies. Then you would then it would feel forced. And I think that is valid criticism, that you're forcing a theme into that you want onto your product. And I think that what I've learned is you want to try to let a product be what it wants to be, rather than trying to force it into your box of what you had originally envisioned. So for Deliverance, I originally wanted it to be a dungeon crawler. So that means that you had to crawl through a dungeon, revealing more map tiles, and you had to discover, treasure chests or whatever that could be mimics on the battlefield. You would reveal random demons or random enemies that may or may not be some sort of elite thing. You might discover all sorts of cool different weapons and items and that kind of thing. And then the final product is not a dungeon crawler at all. You reveal the map, you put the demons on it that you're going to be fighting, and it's a tactical battle game. It's like a tactical combat game or they call it a skirmish game, actually. And that is it has a lot of dungeon crawl elements, a lot of classic video game RPG elements and whatnot. But it originally, I wanted it to be like 6 different battles that you progress through the dungeon each time, and you go from like above ground to below ground, kind of like Diablo style. You're descending the levels of the church into what eventually becomes like this lava hell type area. I had a lot of ideas that just ended up not panning out because I had to eventually lean into what the game kind of wanted to be, where the core fun was. I had to adjust systems to support the core fun, or I had to eliminate systems that stood in the way of players having fun, with that core experience. And sometimes the theme was one area that the anyone that told me this is a bad theme, you shouldn't go with this theme, they were wrong. They were mistaken. But what I thought was, and because the end product is fantastic, people love it for that reason. It's one of the number one reasons people buy the game is because of the theme. And there were a couple of reasons for that, and that was not necessarily it was misguided, but it wasn't given with like ill will. It was another thing. It was constructive criticism that was a very, very important element to pay attention to. But it was something that, as the designer, I'm like, okay, I'm listening to the feedback. You should always appreciate people for giving you feedback. The fact they're willing to give you feedback is meaningful in and of itself. You need that in order to make a better product. But what I would do is I would use that as a gauge whenever, eventually like people stopped telling me that. And people went to the opposite side. It was kind of like, in World of Warcraft, where you have a negative reputation with some faction, they'll attack you on sight. But then as you grow, like you get in a neutral reputation, they stop attacking you, but they're not your friend. And then you elevate past friendly and then honored and whatever, revered. They start to give you special quests, and you start to get special prices from the vendors and whatnot. And I felt like that's what happened with people, where in the beginning they didn't like the theme. And after a while, like the art showed them their character and what they were doing, and it felt like, oh wow, I'm actually fighting the forces of darkness as an epic angel, and I feel epic, and yeah, we gotta protect that saint, and they got into the theme and whatnot. And it just, all of a sudden, there was a moment, I want to say, when we had probably like 10-15% of our art finished, people that people could actually see themselves as an angel on the battlefield playing and battling against demons right around NorwestCon. In fact, when you and I met, that was kind of one of the first conventions is in 2018 that we had this shift of things happening. Remember Argus? We talked with Argus, and he was like, he thought he would not like the theme, but then he actually ended up really liking it, and it made sense to him and all that. That was kind of the moment that that shift happened, where people understood why the game was themed in that way. But for several years before that, it was a lot of negative feedback. And so I would use that negative feedback as a gauge to, eventually became positive feedback to like, how well was I doing? How well was the game kind of, how well did the theme permeate the game? And, there were a lot of things like, for example, something that I cut that was in the way of that was emergent narrative, or I'm sorry, actual narrative. So at one point we had event cards that, kind of like a Dead of Winter Crossroads style game, where you would read a card, make a choice, and then based on the choice, it would be a good thing or a bad thing. It was like, hey, demons are in the front of the movie theater hanging out like losers. What do? Do you go behind do you walk up to them and talk to them, or do you go like in the back door of the theater and sneak around and try to listen into what they're saying, And, that type of thing was it was a little cheesy, but at the, and I'm over cheesing it on purpose for fun, but if you played the game once or twice and you got that card, the right answer. So, you have to have either a million of those cards, and even then you'll eventually figure out, yeah, never talk to the demons in front of the movie theater. Bad stuff always happens, so they put gum in your hair. But so I removed that. And then players, after removing that, I removed all the narrative from the game entirely. And they started to form what had happened is like a narrative inside their head as they were playing. So afterward, when people finished the game, it started to become like another indicator of positivity was, what the theme for me was, when people started to like share about what had happened and how critically close they came to failure. But then, you did this one thing, and it started to make me realize people were connecting with the game and forming narrative inside their own minds. They didn't need narrative from the actual game to tell them what was happening. And so, those are a couple of ways that I was able to use that negativity. And I will say that negative feedback is about 100 times more helpful than positive feedback. So it really becomes like, because positive feedback, it's like, in wrestling, I won a lot of wrestling matches. And I don't really remember many of the matches that I won, unless it was like a super close, razor thin, barely won in overtime or something like that. But I remember a lot of the matches that I lost. I remember what I did and how that match made me better because I lost for a particular reason. I can recall so many matches in my mind that I lost. And so the negative feedback, it sticks with you in a way that I think is generally you can leverage in an effective way. But positive feedback is kind of like, you've got a fan club, but they may not actually be fans. They may just be blowing smoke, and they may not really care. And as the moment that they leave, they may forget you exist. And, but the negative feedback is something that you can actually use to make your product better. So
one thing I'll add as well, Andrew, is, and this is something that I've experienced when playtesting your Angelcraft game, is you always have to kind of keep in mind that some people might not just like a certain type of game, right? So I know whenever I'm trying to give you feedback for Angelcraft, I'm not particularly enamored with the RTS genre. I played Red Alert 2, Tiberian Sun back in the day. One vision, one purpose, brother, not. Right?
Acknowledged.
I like all my feedback. I feel like all my feedback to you is like, don't make an RTS. That's like all my feedback. Like, it's kind of like subtly suggesting that because I don't like the idea of like resource gathering. I prefer something like 40K where you just start with your army, you go and smash people, like Tekken. You have your characters fully developed, and you just go in and smash each other. Or like WoW Arena, you got your character, you just run in. Whilst League of Legends never appealed to me because it's the idea you have to build up your character, you've got to like kill NPCs and things. So that's something to keep in mind though, because some people, they might have feedback, but their feedback is going to be like, make a different game. I'm sure you received a lot of that with Deliverance, right? They just might not like a certain type of game, and like all their feedback was like, hey, make the game that I want.
Yeah. A lot of the time, when you play someone else's game and you give feedback, it's really easy, especially as like a non-designer. You kind of romanticize a version of the game inside your head and think, if they only did these 12 things, it would be so good, and I remember, there would be, there were lots of feedback like that, where people would give me recommendations of, oh, you should add like all sorts of other religions and their angels and whatnot that they've got. You should add you know an out of combat heaven and the shop, where you can spend like 30 minutes inside the shop in heaven and talk to people and have this out of combat experience and whatnot. One thing I really wanted to do that I never got to do was I wanted to do like a day-night cycle, where during the day you would be like, masked as humans and talking to people, figuring out where the bad guys were at and where trouble was and whatever. And then at night you would go in your angelic form and deal with it, and but had to cut stuff like that. But people always want to add things, and I think that the best games are made by actually taking things away rather than adding. There's certainly things that we did add, like for example, the entire Deliverance talent system was the last thing that we added to the game, and it made the game what it is. It's like now you have this cool character that is different every single time you play, or you can build over time and it becomes awesome and stuff. But that was just trying to achieve the vision that we had set forth of this game that had a system that allowed you to basically level up. And we tried a lot of different things that didn't work, but yeah. So overall, I would say the most, for others that have experienced your project, when they give you negative feedback, it's always a good thing. But when they give you no feedback, it's really important to ask and to try to drill in and figure out, like, how can I make this positive person give me negative feedback in a way that doesn't feel like icky to them, And so one of the questions that I started asking, and I would recommend for Donnie, with your project, you give people the first 3 chapters of the book. You're like, what would what would you rate the project? Give it a 1 through 10. People never rate it a 10. And whereas if you rate like on a lower scale, people will actually anyway. So give them a 1 through 10. Like, what would you rate this? People will give you like an 8 or a 9 or whatever, right? But then you ask, what adjustment would you advise to increase that rating by 1 point? And that's been the single most helpful question for me, because it gets positive people to say, well, the one guy wasn't that interesting. If you gave him like just a little bit more explanation and I could understand a little bit more of his backstory, I'd like his character a lot more, or whatever. That is something that you don't naturally receive from people that you would receive if you had a line of questioning like that.
Write that down, children. That's gold right there. No, that's a really good point though. It's like, okay, you rated it a 5 or whatever. It's like, okay, what would make you bring it up one more point? That's such a simple question. Yeah. And that really does, like you said, it brings them in a really positive way. That's really good.
Another question that I found to ask, for feedback is, what did you love most about your experience? So, that a lot of the time they'll have this one moment or this or a particular character or whatever it was that they really enjoyed, that stood out to them, that would make them come back. And you want to identify what other people like about your product. And so that's that was a very helpful question. There are a lot of ways to ask that, but it's just like, what would you rate the game? What did you love most about the experience? What would help you improve the rating by 1 point? What change, what adjustment? And sometimes people say, oh, I can't think of anything, and that's okay too, but just always thank people for their feedback. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, so you had your game, you got your first one out there.
Yep.
So you have Deliverance out there, you have Council of the Fallen is now trying to get out there. It's in process.
Yep.
At this point where you're at, when you see negative feedback, or you see, I know there was a video and stuff that like really kind of like just kind of blasted everything. Like where you're at right now in the process, how are you able to process, negative comments or anything along those ways, unhelpful criticism, or even like cancel culture as a whole,
Yeah. So I think that there are kind of two different lines of discussion here. One is cancel culture, or like people that don't like me or don't like the product trying to throw, like, sling mud. Mudslinging is probably a better way, rather than cancel culture, to express. And then there's the other, which is like actual legitimate negative feedback. And that, and so, like, now that the product is released, we have like 5,000 units of the game out there in the world. People have played it tens of thousands of times. We have maybe hundreds of thousands at this point, I don't know, but we have a lot of people who play a lot of games of Deliverance. And we also have digital, so it's not only on Tabletop Simulator, it's on Board Game Arena, which is in beta right now, but people get in like dozens of games a day on Board Game Arena. And so I get a lot of feedback that about the actual game itself, like, oh, this character feels weak. It's really not. One thing that I love is that now that the game is released, I used to get all sorts of feedback of like, oh, you should not have any female angels, or you should make this character into a fire character instead of a wind character, all sorts of things like that. But now that it's released, people accept that it is what it is, and they stop trying to change the thing. Instead, they just cast judgment on the thing itself, as based on what they see. And so the negative ways that people do that I really don't have any control over. Obviously, they can talk about the game itself. I really don't see much chatter on social media about how the game is not that good or anything. It's it's the highest rated Christian board game on. It's the highest rated game in the religious category on BGG. So of all the religiously themed games, it's rated the highest. But so it's generally not like spoken ill, like, oh, the mechanics were garbage or something like that. But sometimes people will rate it low, and like on Board Game Geek, they'll give it a low rating and explain something, and I know that they got a rule wrong, or they just maybe they had a bad experience with it because they lost. Deliverance is a difficult game. It's kind of like, in a way, it's like Dark Souls. It's like it will just chew you up and spit you out, and you'll be like, how does anybody win this game? And so some of the feedback is attributed to people don't like to lose. Some people like to win. Winning is fun. No matter what the game is, if they won, it's more fun than if they lost, which is very common. Like if you are demoing like a Euro game or something like that, the person who wins is much more likely to find it fun than the person who was in last place, and so it's so that's something that can always corrupt feedback, or that's like a modifier to feedback. But so there are some like people just state their opinions on it, like, I don't like this, but and that's like totally fine, and it doesn't really bother me at all. I've learned it's more important at this point for me to focus on the people who do like it and give them more of what they like, and so that's what I am thankful to have a large swath of fans that have backed the game, that own the game, that engage in our social communities and stuff. That they, it's generally a very positive experience. Outside that, I do have people that like, we hit number 1 on BGG in December of 2023. So like when the game came out, when Deliverance finally hit and came out, we had a bunch of negative ratings of number 1 where people said, get your religion out of my hobby, and other things like that. People were saying that the rating, it was like an 8.9 at some point, and then it went to an 8.8, and then I got a bunch of ratings of 1 that brought it to 8.7 like immediately, because some group said 8.8 is a dog whistle, and it's like I purposefully rated it that because of white supremacy, and it's like I don't control this, and I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't want to know what this means either, but and definitely don't have anything to do with that. But they people say what they say, and Board Game Geek was we'll say less than sympathetic to those reviews. Like they didn't care that those reviews were there. They didn't make any changes, and then my community actually rioted. They got very upset that there were so many ratings of 1 that basically called me bigoted, and all the phobes terms that you can use. I was called all of those things, and my community, a lot of them use Board Game Geek. They basically did this. They rallied around. I didn't start anything at all, but and I didn't want to be seen as some agitator, on BGG. I know I'm a guest on the platform, really, but all the users that were also fans of Deliverance were very upset about all of the really what amounted to things that were against Board Game Geek's terms of service. You can't disparage someone based on their religion or their race or their sexual orientation or things like that. And there were a lot of people that were disparaging me because of my religion, in ratings of 1. And so finally, those things started getting deleted, and then people would repost them. Eventually, what BGG started doing was just like frustrating for me, is they just started removing the comments, but leaving the rating of 1. So, or 2 or 4 or whatever. So we got a ton of low ratings at that time when we were ranked number 1 hotness on BGG from people that are activist, mindset, that didn't really have any stake in the game. They never played it. They didn't have an experience with it, but they just decided, oh, this is a thing I don't like. So I'm going to, take 2 seconds and try to put a little jab at this product, and that type of thing. It's like, eventually you just have to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, I can't control that anyway. So you just have to focus on the positive people. Okay, so there was this one video that was posted that was negative, just a negative review, which I generally recommend. Like, if somebody is a reviewer and posts a negative review, like don't even watch it. Like, you don't need to put it into your mind. Like, if you want to make your product better, you should talk to your player base, your fans. Really what you're kind of trying to fight for are all the people in the middle that are maybe not totally informed, but are kind of trying to make up their mind. And the more that you personally say, I find that the more room there is for messing up. So if you just talk less and let your product speak for itself, that's generally my recommendation. But it's hard to do that, especially in the beginning when you don't have, like what we're talking about. I have communities that have thousands of fans and whatnot. What about like when you have like very few fans? It's like it's like I would call it like a problem upon a heap of blessings that I have. Some people that have tried to cancel me or whatever, if you want to call it that, or just that were negative. But it's much more miserable, I think, to be in a position where you're trying to make something, you see the potential in your idea, and nobody really gives you that much, like, the time of day. Like, you post on social media and it's like you get 4 likes and they're 3 of them are from your, you know, your fellow employees that you work with at your company or whatever, right? And your mom. It's like, why won't people in the group that should be my target market, why aren't they even like paying me any mind, you know? And I find that is because you haven't given anybody an experience that they can relate to yet, that like a tangible experience with your product, and so they don't have the capacity to care about it because it's not an experience that they've actually had. They've heard about it, they've heard you talk about it, but they haven't actually played it, so they don't have any understanding of what what you're talking about. It's like, oh, we have, like, I don't know, for Deliverance, I love the min maxing is what it's called. Like when you try to make the very best version of a character you can, you try to come up with like the coolest build and everything like that. It's like, I would love to have those conversations, but I could not have those conversations until the actual game box was in someone's hands and they've played a few times. And then it's like, oh man, their capacity, their willingness to understand and to learn is so increased from before, but before they actually have the product in their hands, it's like insanely hard to just have a conversation about strategy or something like that, and that can be really difficult. So that's why I call it the lonely road. Game design is a rather lonely road.
Sometimes min-maxing can ruin games, though, as well. You got to be careful with that. Sometimes, winning is not always the way to go. My sister-in-law, we were watching Netflix, and Netflix has this like trivia system where you can ask questions, and on a remote you sort of select answers, and they're kind of binary. And it rewards you by the speed by which you answer the question correctly. And I figured that if you just randomize your answer, you're bound to get like a streak, and then you'd have like a really high score because you get like three right in a row, and you'd have like a super high score, and like the probability of getting it right doing that was higher than if you actually just try to answer it legitimately. So I discovered this min-max the entire quiz and was like thrashing everyone. And everyone was like, "You're cheating." So I'm not cheating. I've just broken your game. But like they weren't having fun, so I stopped doing that because thrashing people so many times with your superior strategy gets old after a while.
Yeah. That's one thing that you have to be careful of is that, so like I have an internal staff that works on Deliverance every day. And we also have a playtesting group of about 20 people that play on Tabletop Simulator and whatnot. And they, the new scenarios that we're working on, stuff like that. And a lot of the time they'll be like, yeah, this one was pretty easy. I didn't really feel challenged. It was really straightforward. And I'm like, okay, great. That means that every regular player is going to have such a terrible time with this game. If you feel like it's okay, then it's really hard. And so sometimes people will give feedback like, oh, this felt easy. Like, oh, good. So regular players will actually stand a chance at this one, And so a lot of the time when we design, we often, if you kind of travel in the same circles, you'll start to like elevate the difficulty or elevate the complexity of something just so that it continues to challenge you. And I recognized this early on with Deliverance as, as like a basically the min-maxers are going to go after this, as well as the like the casual person. How do I make it harder for the min-maxer without also ramping the difficulty for the casual person who has just experienced this? I guess for you, Donnie, if you were to write, if it were to be a book, it would be the equivalent of writing like Tom Clancy, who has, or Robert Jordan, who has like 900 characters in the first 3 chapters of his books.
Right.
Versus, I don't know, something simpler like C.S. Lewis or whatever, who just explains a beautiful story simply, right? And so yeah, I think that finding newbie feedback is oftentimes more effective than experienced gamer feedback or experienced whatever feedback, like experienced reader or you name it. Like, for example, me, I'm a 39-year-old dude. Like, if you're writing a young adult fiction, make sure you have like teenagers reading it, and giving you feedback and that kind of thing, because they're going to give you different feedback than I would.
That actually reminds me, I was watching a documentary about The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and the publisher at the time had his son read the manuscripts that were sent for children's stories to The Hobbit, because if it's written for children, then children need to enjoy it. So he used to pay his son, I think it was like a shilling or something, to like read books and then write a report on it. And his son recommended The Hobbit, and he said it was the best shilling he ever spent. So that was really great. This publisher, even though they were publishing children's books, they actually had children read the book and offer feedback. They didn't read them themselves. I thought that was really interesting. Kind of just reminded me of what you were saying. So yes, you kind of need to find people that you're trying to reach and target them and get them to give you feedback.
Yeah. So I guess that's anything else you want to drill into in regard to dealing with negativity?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of really went into some like heavy stuff. So it's like, so at the end of the day, when you're laying down at night, how can you know that it's like you're on the right track? Like, you know what I mean? It's like you see all these different things, and you lay down. It's like how can you lay your head down at night and just relax, and knowing that's like, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. So I found myself being very goal oriented. For so I would build Deliverance. I build whatever version of Deliverance. I would take it to a convention. I would get whatever feedback I got. I would strive to work and fix whatever issues were present in that edition of the game so that I would not receive that same feedback again. If it was like, oh, this game felt way too slow, then I made sure, like at Kingdom Con, I made sure to increase the number of resources that you start with, because then I would not receive that same feedback. In fact, you can do this like between, from one game to the next. If you're playtesting a book is a little bit different, but you can give people, just you want to make sure that you update the product after you've received feedback before you let other people test it, unless you're not sure that feedback was actually valid. Sometimes I remember one time I had a guy, we had a status effect in the game called blind, which reduced your accuracy. So you would roll a dice, try to hit something, it would actually lower your overall dice result. This was before we entirely removed dice rolling to hit. But a guy covered his eyes and walked around like a board game shop, like a zombie or like Frankenstein, saying, "I'm blind, I'm an angel, and I can't hit anything." And his point was that an angel getting blind is so ridiculous that it shouldn't even exist in the game and whatever, but I wasn't quite convinced. Even with his epic acting, I wasn't convinced that was the right move, and so I needed more feedback, and I wasn't willing to remove the status effect just because of that one bit of feedback. But there are many cases where there are things you need to change. I think it's so important to update those things before seeking additional feedback so that you never receive the same exact feedback. I think it's so frustrating to me when I remember one time I had to go to a convention with the exact same version of the game that I brought previously, and I knew the feedback I was going to receive. I received exactly that feedback and was like, this whole convention was a waste, other than like email addresses that people might eventually back our Kickstarter or whatever, or would follow along for updates. The actual feedback was not helpful because I knew those things already. So I kind of made it a goal to not go to conventions too quickly, because I wanted, I wanted to space them apart enough that I could update the game and get, if I needed to change keywords on all the cards or something, that I could actually do that before going to the next convention. Because I didn't want to get the same exact feedback again, because that's not helpful if I already know those things. So I was goal oriented. I would set a date that was a hard date. It was like, I am going to this convention in 2 months. And that means that I have 5 weeks to update my files, and I have just enough time to print them and get them, turned into the actual game and whatnot, and update the copy of the game that I have to take to that convention. And I must get those things done by that date. and it wasn't like an internal date that I set in my head that like, okay, by, in 2 months from now on this date, I'm going to have the next thing done because that's when I want it done. It was like, no, I'm going to convention and I'm going to have a product there that's either going to not be the right, not be the finished product, or, maybe it will. And so that's the main thing. You mentioned like, or you asked when I lay my head down at night thinking, have I done all that I can do? Those are my benchmarks for have I designed, and now like, even now with our Kickstarter campaign, we have about 5 months of time to finish the design of our scenarios and the campaign for the Deliverance Council of the Fallen game. And so we have benchmarks every month. We need to have a certain number of scenarios completed and other things like that. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And one of the smallest things is like I want a new piece of content for my playtesters to test every single week, which means that one scenario at minimum every single week I need a new one. And it's not very helpful to get the playtesters to test the exact same scenario over and over again. I'll get the exact same feedback over and over again. And so that's kind of where that's what my measure of success is to myself at night. What is not a measure of success for me is how much money I made during the Kickstarter. It's never enough money. I made $300,000 and change, $314,000 our first Kickstarter. We made $500,000 in our next Kickstarter, and we'll probably do like $1.5 million of revenue from the product that we order and the Kickstarter and everything like that. It's all going to be ground up by the machine, making the next games, making, other things like that, building an empire. No money is going to actually be sunk into my house, from the Kickstarter that I put together. But so that to me has kind of become much less of a measure of success. It's like getting the product out to people so that they can enjoy it. That's like the number one thing. And I'm thinking like, maybe Deliverance is gonna rest after this Kickstarter. I don't know. We'll continue to work on stuff, but there might not be any new like physical Deliverance content out for like 2-3 years after this next game releases. So I need to make sure that this one is really good and that people enjoy it, and that it's something that people really are glad that they invested into, and that kind of builds the legacy of the game, and all that. So one day we'll make billions with movie deals or something like that, but not it's not something I'm so concerned about. I'm just concerned that the product is good. So that's how I get there.
That's awesome, man. Any quick like bullet points? Like, okay, so newbie designer again. I'm going to say it again. Crossing the chasm, because I've been reading Brandon Sanderson. So there you go. Like what are those like? You telling me?
Bridge 4 was the most miserable chapter I've ever read in a book. I was so riveted, and I hated it.
I know, right?
The whole time. I was with Kaladin.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. He's solid. I've been reading Elantris lately. Yeah. But anyway, we could talk hours on that too, I'm sure. But yeah, so what are those like key takeaways for someone who's like, okay, I'm about to cross that bridge, I'm about to click that button.
Yeah.
Like in regards to like how to handle feedback. Like what are those key takeaways?
The first key takeaway is thank you for your feedback. Those are words that you should memorize and use all the time. It's one of the best ways to, when somebody's being a total turkey about, whatever their feedback is, it's so important. You have to listen to me and whatever, just say thank you for your feedback. Don't explain why something is the way it is. Just say thank you for your feedback. It acknowledges that they gave you feedback, and it also kind of shuts down additional conversation about or additional arguments. You don't want to argue with your people that are giving you feedback. So that's one thing that I see a lot of rookie designers or fledgling designers do that they don't intend to do. It's like, just, don't defend your design, but just receive feedback and appreciate them for that. Another thing is like, I see a lot with others when somebody is hypercritical of your product all the time, oftentimes they might be like the biggest super fan you've ever had, but it's easy for people to get really annoying to you if you see them all the time criticizing what it is rather than giving you praise and criticizing. Some people, you'll want to give whatever it is, 10 compliments for every one negative feedback, or it's 5-1 is the ratio, something like that.
Hmm.
And there are some people that just give only negative, that only speak out negatively. And it's really, really important to recognize that those people could be your biggest fans that just want to make the thing great. And they're going to be the ones that challenge you as far as, the good ideas. You'll be able to make sure that they're good by critically thinking about the feedback that you receive from this super fan. And sometimes, you can just ignore some, when they get real excessive and real passionate, you can just ignore them with the words, "Thank you for your feedback." Really appreciate it. It doesn't invite further discussion. It acknowledges that you received what it is that they said, and will avoid a lot of problems in the future. And then the second thing is just to make sure that you're continuing to develop the product so that you don't receive the same exact feedback. And so, yeah, and I'll just state again, like, don't defend yourself. Don't defend your choices to me. It's the the most noob thing ever when I hear somebody like, "Oh, well, the reason I did that was because of this, that, and the other." It's like, yeah, but like I played your game and it sucked, for this reason. I don't know why you did that, but I just didn't have fun here. Um, just don't miss the constructive feedback by trying to defend yourself. I'm not saying that it's never right to defend yourself. I personally don't defend my ideas or defend my product, or let the product speak for itself. But yeah, just make sure not to miss the constructive criticism. Yeah, so especially from those close to you, by the way. I'll mention that my wife is like my number one source of feedback, and also the person that I respect least in practice in regard to like dealing with feedback. I am not very I can be really, really stubborn with my wife, because she knows all the things, and I don't know why I'm so stubborn, but she is. If I just listened to her the first time on so many different bits of feedback, I would have cut like 2 years off of the development cycle of Deliverance. And, she knew the game the best and was able to give the best feedback. And also at the same time was the hardest one to just accept what it is that she had to say. So sometimes you might have loved ones, family members, or friends that are very close to the project, and give their feedback like a little bit of an extra weight, so. Other than that, that's what I got. Anything else from, any ideas, Sean?
No, I think that's all pretty sound. Nothing comes to mind.
All right. Well, very good. So Donnie, what, before we go, what is the project name?
So what I've been working on, we talked about it, I think a couple of podcasts back too, but it's called Seraphima, The Convergence of Fireflies. And it is a story of a young mouse and his cousin and his best friend. And they go on this journey discovering the secrets of the ship, the Seraphima, which was this legendary ship that helped protect the coastline where they live. So it's kind of this, like, there's a lot of mystery involved. There's a lot of adventure involved. Kind of a young adults, middle grade, somewhere in there, style story, a coming of age kind of story. And it's all the journeys that they go on and trying to discover the secrets of the Seraphima. So yeah, it's fun because you've seen it from like when I really picked it up as like a game design, and then back into like, okay, no, I need to write the story first. So that's where we've been at. Yeah. So that's the idea. And I think it'll be really fun for people who enjoy things like Mouse Guard and Redwall, and even things like the Goonies, like any of those coming of age style stories. I think it'll really appeal to people.
That's awesome. And I believe that the website is worldofseraphima.com, right?
Yeah, worldofseraphima.com. You can sign up there to get news updates and things. We're kind of revamping how we do our email updates and things. But yeah, that's where you would go.
Awesome. All right. Well, fantastic. Thanks for asking that question on air for hundreds of people to listen to.
Absolutely. Thanks for answering these questions. I know because it's these things that like they get talked about, but not really. And there's not really anything like, okay, actionable. How do I, okay, I have this information. Now, what do I do with it? You know? So
Yeah.
no, I appreciate you answering these questions. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, my pleasure. I'll say one last thing and then I'll let Robot Richard send us out, which is marketing is going to tell you what the world actually thinks. If you can't get emails to subscribe to your list for under $4.50 or whatever, it's oftentimes a side effect of actual feedback that you've received that you've not acted upon. So, or feedback that you have neglected to solicit that would have told you there's a problem. And so that's why it's so important to collect feedback before you actually market a product, especially a game, anything social, anything tabletop, anything like a book. It's so important to collect that feedback because in the end, the market will be honest with you. People one at a time may be positive, but then when you release it to the world, the market will speak with its wallet. Right. And so if in the end you can't find 300 backers, it's probably because there's feedback that you needed to implement that you did not. So don't find yourself in that position at the end of the road. Just make sure to stay humble and receive feedback. So there you go. It's my last 2 cents. Robot Richard, send us on out.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. For more resources, articles, and to listen to past podcasts, please visit us at crowdfundingnerds.com. And if you have a crowdfunding question, we also have a page on our site where you can send a message directly to us. Please visit crowdfundingnerds.com/question. And if your question is a great question, we may include it in a future podcast. Thank you all again for listening to this week's episode, and we'll see you next week. Stay nerdy.